Hello and good morning and welcome to our webinar. This is Mel Harcourt from the FDEA. Our webinar today is on agency agreements and getting the paperwork right, brought to you by Associate Member Julia Seary of Roythornes Solicitors. Before we start the presentation, just a few housekeeping points. You'll notice that in the corner there is a chat box. Please use this to communicate with us as participants are muted. It's better audio quality. So if you do need to ask us a question, please use the chat box. If someone could just confirm now that they can hear me okay in the chat box, that would be great. If you are having problems with the audio at all, I have added in the phone number and the PIN number, which you can dial in for a better sound quality on your mobile. So do try that if you can't hear us properly. The chat box function we'll be using for questions. So if you type any questions as Julia goes through the presentation in this box, just for continuity's sake, she will be answering questions once the presentation has finished. And just to let you know that this webinar is also being recorded and we'll send it to you by email afterwards. So now I'm going to hand over to Julia. Like I said, if somebody can just confirm in the chat box that you can hear me, just so that we're definitely being heard, that would be great. Julia, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Mel. It's Julia Seary speaking. Welcome to everybody to today's webinar. We've had one confirmation that you can hear Mel. I'd be very grateful if somebody wouldn't mind just sending another quick chat just to say that you can also hear me. And in the meantime, I will carry on. So welcome to this morning. It is agency and distribution agreements, getting the paperwork right. As we go through, as Mel says, yes, please do jot down your questions in the chat box and we will deal with those later. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to cover what is agency and an agent, and equally what is distributorship and a distributor, and also talk in terms of what I consider to be the 3R differentiators, how actually in practical real terms you can differentiate between when you are dealing with an agent and when you're dealing with a distributor, because it isn't always entirely clear and you do sometimes have to look at these different elements to make sure that you are in the right area. We'll then look at the advantages and disadvantages of engaging an agent, and also as part of that we'll cover the commercial agents regulations. And then again we will look at the advantages and disadvantages of engaging a distributor. And we'll also just we'll touch on selective distribution. I'm not sure that's going to be absolutely relevant to yourselves, but it is just to cover this off as well, just to get so you get a full coverage of all different types of distribution arrangements. We'll then move on to both practical considerations of when you're engaging a business partner, whether that's as an agent or a distributor, and also from a documentary perspective, making sure that when you're looking at the paperwork, you do get that right and it correctly reflects what status you're dealing with, agent or distributor. And no webinar, I think, would be complete without obviously mentioning Brexit. And then, as I say, we will pick up questions at the end. So moving on, in terms of agency, just because you call somebody an agent or your document refers to agency, just be careful, because if actually, even if you're referring to something that actually you're really wanting to be in the realms of a distributor, you think you're dealing as a distributor and you're referring throughout your whole agreement to a distributorship, if actually from the paperwork and in practical terms what you are doing looks and feels like an agent, then it will be one of agency by law. And as you'll see when we come to talking about the regulations for agency, this is why it is particularly crucial. I'm sure, as you are aware, just right back to basics, an agent is somebody that really acts as an intermediary. They're really involved in facilitating a supply contract between yourselves as the principal supplier and a customer. So they sit in between. you tend to get two different types of agency. Firstly, you'll get your sales agent, and this is where you are giving that partner authority to enter into agreements with your customers on behalf of yourself. So you are giving them authority. In that case, although they are not part of the contractual relationship between the customer, they do have the ability to bind you into arrangements and deals because you've given them that authority. As an alternative approach, a more restricted status is when you are appointing a party as a marketing or introduction or referral agent, any of those terms. And that is when you're giving a party authority, but only limited to merely marketing and promoting your products. Effectively, you as the supplier complete the deal. You are not under any obligation to go ahead with any arrangement unless you have got involved in the paperwork and signed the arrangement. In terms of the types of agency you will be considering, you've got an exclusive arrangement where you effectively agree with the agent that you can't appoint any other agents or distributors or resellers, or equally you can't actively seek sales in the territory you give to the agent. That is when you're giving absolute exclusivity to one agent. It might be in relation to a particular territory, for example. An alternative to this is what we call a sole agency. Now, this is where you are saying to the agent, you're agreeing that you can't appoint agents or distributors or resellers in their particular territory that you've given to them, but you can actively seek your own sales directly. So that means that although you're giving some exclusivity, it doesn't stop you selling directly into that territory. And then obviously, as an alternative to those two, it's when you arrange a much more a non-exclusive basis. Effectively, you may appoint a number of agents. You certainly give yourselves the ability to appoint freely other agents or distributors or resellers within a particular territory worldwide. So that is obviously the loosest type of agency arrangement. When you compare that to a distributorship arrangement, you can see the marked differences. Again, the first bullet is just to remind you that if actually you might be referring to agent and agency, but the look and feel, the actual relationship is actually one of distributorship, then you will be dealing as a distributor. So you have to be careful that even if the paperwork says one thing, if actually the terms and the business practice is such that it is something different, then the law will follow what actually is happening in practice. In a distributor arrangement, the distributor effectively facilitates sales by purchasing products or services from yourselves, from suppliers, and then reselling to customers on their own account. So it is in this case where the distributor contracts with the customer directly. And you've got, again, various types of distribution arrangements. Similarly to agency, you've got an exclusive arrangement whereby you're saying that you can't appoint other distributors or resellers or agents or actively seek sales in their territory that you've given them. A sole arrangement where you say you won't appoint third parties, but you can actively seek sales in the territory, or non-exclusive. So effectively you're saying, yes, we will distribute our products via yourselves, but equally we are able to then actively seek sales in the territory as well ourselves and appoint others in the territory. The other type, which is slightly different, but it is worth mentioning, is selective distributorship. This is where suppliers of products or manufacturers, they only appoint distributors if those distributors meet prescribed criteria. And this is particularly common in the more luxury goods market or the motor industry. And we will talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. In real terms, there tend to be differentiators, and I think it's useful to look at those in terms of what I call the 3 R's: the relationship, revenue, and risk. So when you're looking at from a relationship perspective, you can see that the agent acts on behalf of the supplier in accordance with the supplier's instructions, the classic agency arrangement in terms of agency law. Now, an agent may or may not invoice a customer, so it's not that the money will definitely not flow through a customer because revenues can flow through the agent, but they will not be party to the sales contract. So effectively, from a contractual perspective, the contract is direct between the supplier and the customer. This obviously also means that the agent doesn't own the customer, and this can be of critical importance as to whether or not you want ownership of the customer database. An agent won't necessarily have that will not have that customer ownership. A distributor, by contrast, effectively becomes a supplier. You have a classic supply chain, and the distributor becomes a supplier to its own customer under a sales contract of its own, and it effectively then controls the customer. In terms of revenue, agents are usually paid commission on a percentage basis. I say usually because there are cases where, even though it is worded more in terms of some sort of margins or not a guaranteed amount, it doesn't necessarily negate there being an agency, but usually you will see arrangements where agents are paid commission on a percentage basis for sales. By contrast, a distributor will usually add a margin to obviously cover some costs, and that is how they will make their profit. From a risk perspective, as we've said earlier, an agent doesn't actually own the products ever. So there's effectively no stock or liability risk for an agent, whereas by contrast, a distributor will own the products and so effectively takes the risk of non-sale and also takes the risk of product liability, especially as an importer. And that, again, that is a key differentiator of risk between an agent and a distributor. In terms of advantages and disadvantages of engaging an agent, as we've said, you will retain control in terms of sale. From a price and marketing strategy, in appointing an agent, the principal retains control in terms of price and marketing. They have direct contact with customers for after-sales service as well, and they own the relationship with that customer. You'll also typically get fewer competition law issues because you are only acting in an agency arrangement, and typically the commission paid to an agent is lower than a margin which a distributor can earn. Obviously, because you've got certain advantages, there are downsides of engaging with an agent. Effectively, as a supplier, as a principal, you would retain all the financial risk of products not selling. You could be regarded as trading in a territory, whereas where you're agent-based, which could lead to tax liabilities because you could be deemed to be actually trading in the overseas territory. And obviously, due to agency, you could be liable for acts of your agent. The key disadvantage if you're a principal or advantage if you're an agent does come down to the commercial agents regulations. Now, moving on to the commercial agents regulations, I don't know whether or not you're familiar with these, but these are it's a piece of EU legislation. It applies to all agents' activities performed within the EEA. It effectively, this piece of legislation has been around since 1993. It imparts certain legal requirements on the principal which benefit the agent. In essence, it's quite useful to think of it. It's slightly similar to an employment law scenario. So what the law is trying to say is that if you appoint an agent, you can't just hire and fire agents without some element of responsibility for those agents. So effectively, this piece of legislation comes in to say that if you take on an agent, you must ensure that you treat that agent fairly, and when it comes to any type of termination arrangements, that there is compensation if you do walk away for the arrangement. The key element to remember is that even if you try to, in your contract, negate the commercial agency regulations, by law, you cannot contract out of this piece of legislation. So the agent has absolute entitlement to rights during the contractual term and after termination. The elements to bear in mind are notice periods, so you must give fair termination notice periods for an agency arrangement. there is some commission rates obligations to make sure that commission is effectively fair and reasonable, and also timing for payment. You must make sure you pay your agents in a timely, prompt manner. And most importantly, and this is where clients do get caught out because not everybody is necessarily aware of this piece of legislation, if you terminate an agency arrangement, then you could well be liable to pay compensation. Now, if you don't mention anything in your agreement, then the default position is that there'll be compensation, which is based on the loss of the value of the agency to the agent. So it isn't a calculation done based on the value of that agency. If you are a principal and you are aware of this piece of legislation, then although you can't contract out of it, we certainly recommend that you do state in the contract that compensation is paid not on that model, but what we call an indemnity model. And that means that you can, in fact, cap the payment to 1 year's commission, which is based on an average of 5 years. But that really is your minimum. It is only based on activities within the EEA, and as I'll mention later, there may be scenarios where part of your activity is within the EEA and part is not. So, you know, that scenario, you may not be liable for all of your agency arrangements, but you do need to bear in mind in relation to your European dealings. Moving on to the advantages and disadvantages of engaging a distributor, as we've said, it is possible to pass on a large degree of the associated risk if you appoint a distributor. I think equally, distributors may well be more motivated in sales because they do take an element of risk in failing to make those sales, and you're not, as a principal, liable for those distributors' activities. You don't need to have an established place of business in the distributor's territory, and so of course, as comparing that to an agency arrangement, this can reduce the administrative cost and potential tax liability because that all sits within the distributor's realm. There is no need to establish and monitor customer accounts overseas, particularly because effectively that is your distributor's area, and you have no risk of having to pay any compensation or indemnity under the commercial agency regulations. So again, there is some risk mitigation there. However, in engaging a distributor, you will have less control over that distributor's activities. They are obviously free to make their sales onward as they choose. And the entire credit risk within a territory could rest on a sole distributor if you go down an exclusive basis. So you can see how you could be at risk in certain for that distributor if there is a financial instability or lack of sales from that distributor. And you do need to be aware of competition law risks. Certainly in relation to Europe, you have to be careful that you don't get involved with the distributor's pricing. That must be for them to set their own prices independently of your pricing, and particularly you can't set minimum prices. You have to be very careful of resale price maintenance. You also have to be careful that you don't restrict distributors in terms of online sales, and also that you have to also be aware in your arrangements that although you agree not to actively sell into territories, you don't end up with anything in an arrangement that talks about the fact that you can't respond to passive sales yourself. So there are some competition law issues which you need to make sure you get right in terms of the paperwork. Now, I mentioned earlier selective distribution. This does tend to be when you've got luxury goods, designer goods, high-value items, particularly where you need some sort of enhanced customer service or after-sales support. So electrical, cosmetics, pharmaceutical, motor industry, for example. However, just very quickly, in terms of selective distribution, it is implemented, you can see when you think about those types of products, to control location or the quality of the outlets that are going to be stocking products. So it makes sure that you maintain a high-end brand image and you add value and you increase competition. It allows suppliers to appoint distributors with specific skill sets. So if in terms of selling these types of products, you do need to have a certain amount of experience or training, or equally, the way a product is presented in the point of sale outlets, that you ensure that that will meet what you as the manufacturer, the producer, that you expect, that your customers expect, and what you require in order to maintain your customer satisfaction. Despite competition law restrictions, it actually does enable you to restrict sales only to other approved distributors or consumers. So it just gives a lot more control in terms of the distribution chain. However, you can struggle with market penetration, because obviously if you put in your criteria, those criteria have got to be across the board. And so that is why as well, it only really is relevant for certain types of designer high value items. And these types of arrangements, because they are high value, they can be potentially costly in terms of any disputes. In terms of the practical considerations, this applies both for agency and distribution agreements. When you are engaging any type of third-party partner for exporting, selling products, you, as a principle, do need to ensure that either you research local law practices for the rights and obligations of the distributor or the agent overseas, or you make sure you pass that burden on to the distributor agent to make sure that they have an obligation to notify you of what the laws and practices are that are requirements in overseas. I mean, I think as a starting point, you actually should take a step back and make sure that appointing a third party is indeed preferable to creating your own sales force, because obviously you could do this yourself, but you would want to make sure that you've got good reason to engage a third party. I think when you're looking at overseas exporting and importing, then often agency distribution is the obvious way to go to ensure that you get that market penetration. In terms of the choice of agency or distribution, you would want to be looking at whether it is key to have control over pricing, terms of sales, the way you're promoting, you're marketing your products, and also customers, whether you want control over the customers, or whether you actually want to offload the risk of consignment stock, because obviously in appointing a distributor, you can immediately offload that consignment risk. In terms of agents, if you have agreed with your agent that they may well be invoicing so that effectively you've got cash flow via your agent, you do need to make sure whether there is any risk in that agent holding customer funds pending remittance. So just be careful in terms of due diligence and agents' financial standings. You should check for credit risk, sales of competing products, track record and references. In any arrangement, you want to know exactly what that third party is doing in terms of the competition, and also in alternative sales, and if possible, get references in terms of financial standing, etc. Whether you're operating within your own territory, but particularly if you are operating further afield, you should obviously always look at some due diligence in terms of bribery, tax evasion risks, and also obviously the Modern Slavery Act, but particularly bribery and tax evasion risks. There is strict criminal liability for acts committed by associated persons. So you should be very careful when you are engaging with any third parties that you're not caught up in some corrupt activity by virtue of appointing third parties that are acting unlawfully. And yes, as I've said, compliance with Modern Slavery Act as well, the obligations there. You may want to have minimum quotas or sales guarantees. That is obviously a commercial point that you would want to discuss with your third party, whether your agent or your distributor. And it can be useful if you're unsure in terms of an arrangement. You might even put in termination rights if the quota sales guarantees were not met, Or alternatively, if you don't want to go as far as terminating, if you were engaging on an exclusive basis, you might open that up to being a non-exclusive arrangement if quotas and sales guarantees are not met. In terms of dealing with overseas parties, you do need to make sure that whoever is executing paperwork, that there is an authorised representative to execute, and obviously check with local laws and whether there's any notarisation obligations, and also whether you need to register on any foreign commercial register or have a translation put in place. And then finally, obviously, from an insurance perspective, you've got to make sure that you're covered off from a product liability perspective, because it can go all the way up the chain. Particularly from moving on to look at the documentation, it really is important when you're writing up these documents that there is clarity of the arrangement. This is where it can get confusing. If you are talking about an agent, you want to be very clear. Are you talking about a marketing agent who just is introducing customers to you, or are you talking about a sales agent where there is authority to bind the principal, the producer, into the contracts with the customers, and making sure that's very clear in the documentation? Or alternatively, are you talking about a distributor? So making sure that the wording is very clear. Secondly, in terms of scope, it's very common to look at agreements where it's confusing as to what territories you're talking about, what customer grouping you're talking about, and what arrangements and appointments you've got. So again, be very clear which territories are covered, or if it's not a whole territory, which group of customers are you referring to that you're giving authority for these third parties to sell to. And also the basis of appointment, whether you're thinking exclusive, sole, or non-exclusive. And be careful, particularly in terms of exclusive and sole, because they are different. And my advice would be that not only just to use that terminology, to actually really spell out what you mean, really set out what you're saying in terms of onward sales. You may actually want to reserve some rights to yourself to certain customers. So for example, you might have certain large accounts in certain territories that you actually want to exclude from the arrangement. So again, you want to be absolutely clear in terms of any reservation of rights. We talked earlier about local legal compliance. Again, you want to be very clear who is responsible for the local law legal compliance and export-import taxes and permits. Set it all out in the documents as to exactly what you mean, to make sure that there's no confusion, or there isn't something isn't missed because one party assumed the other party was taking responsibility for it. And also marketing and promotional obligations. There may be some arrangement in terms of contributions or fees for marketing and promotions, or there may be some practical involvement, assistance that's being expected. So again, set that all out. In terms of the term of the agreement, you want to be very clear if there's a minimum term, what that is. Notice periods, be very clear on what they are for termination notice, or if there's any renewal rights. With term, I always think it's better to have a rolling agreement with a termination right, rather than have a scenario where you've got to ensure that you renew before a certain period. Because in reality, if the relationship is going well, these agreements are put away and they're not really looked at. And it's easy to miss dates. So when you're looking at putting documents in place, try and ensure that in the back of your head you're always thinking about a default position, that dates are not missed easily by either party. So arrangements roll on until somebody serves notice, for example. Be very careful if you're reading agreements, because the term, it can look very innocuous, but actually be careful, because if sometimes you can miss a date for a termination, and then you might not get you might have to wait a whole 12 months before you get the opportunity to exit that agreement. So again, be very careful. And if possible, I would say, unless you want to tie people in year to year, avoid that. Try and ensure that it is possible to pick up the document at any point and serve your notice period at that point under whatever you've got, 3 months or 6 months termination periods. Equally, if you want to tie a party in, then yes, you do it on an annual basis, and there may only be a window of opportunity to serve a notice period, after which you've got to wait for another whole 12 months. But it is definitely something worth looking at carefully and getting somebody to look at, because it can be easy to end up caught by those provisions. Also, think in terms of new products. So does your agreement cover just the products as listed, or do you want to include all future developed products, products that are similar to the products that you're selling, or is that only by agreement? Do you want to ensure that you control what is captured within the agreement going forward? In terms of distributorship arrangements, one area just to be careful of is making sure you've got adequate retention of title provisions in every agreement. If you are selling products and you're not paid, if you're giving a credit period of 30 days after delivery or 60 days after delivery, make sure that the agreement includes clear retention of title. And the reason that that's important is that although you want the risk of the products to pass immediately on delivery, you want to still hold legal title to those products, so that if you're not paid, you have the right to go in and get those products back. Or particularly if there is an insolvency situation, that if an insolvency practitioner is then claiming rights and control over all assets of that company, that you actually can waive your agreement and say, well, actually, we've still got title in those products, and therefore we are entitled to take those products back. So that is quite important if you're giving any period of credit. So yes, certainly, if you've got a distributor arrangement, you would, that they would have their own terms of sale, but you need to be careful that you avoid influencing the prices. We've talked about resale price maintenance and being very careful that you're not getting involved in their pricing. In terms of an agency arrangement, I think I mentioned earlier, you may have activity that's both Europe-based and non-Europe-based. One way of dealing with this, because of the commercial agency regulations and the fact you cannot contract out of those, particularly for a termination, which could be 10 or 15 years down the line, one approach is actually to separate out your documents. So you have one document that covers all of your EEA activity and all the commissions under that document, and then another document for non-EEA activity. And this would just make it easier and more straightforward if it comes to calculating any type of termination compensation that you've got to cover off. Be careful in terms of non-compete, both during and after termination of the agreement. Make sure that you keep it to a 2-year maximum period from a competition law perspective. And lastly, just make sure that in terms of if you've got intellectual property to be protected, make sure that in your agreement you put an obligation on your third parties down the supply chain to notify you of potential infringements by third parties. Equally, you want to make sure that you include provisions that if you need to do a fast product recall, that your distributors are under a legal obligation to assist with that, because you need to make sure that you can trigger that quickly and effectively. And then finally, just moving on to a quick mention of Brexit. These arrangements really, they're creatures of UK common law, and it's contract law pretty much. Other than obviously we've talked about the commercial agency regulations, but in any event, the European Union Withdrawal Act, that will ensure that EU law remains part of the UK law until the government decides otherwise. So there will be no instant change. The one provision which lots of clients are considering currently are these Brexit clauses, which I'm sure you may well have come across. Effectively, we have provisions in agreements across the whole broad commercial range of agreements where a clause is triggered if Brexit affects ability to perform a contract or impacts costs of performing, which end up creating an adverse financial impact, then sometimes you might have provisions that either give the parties the right to renegotiate the commercials or even potentially terminate. So you could consider including clauses like that in agreements. And then finally, just in terms of UK exporters selling into the EU, you would actually then need to look carefully in terms of export health certificates. You need to contact the Animal Plant and Health Agency, and also checked with the local country's food authorities. Again, you may need health certification or export licenses. So that's it in terms of the webinar presentation. We do have time for some questions. I haven't seen any questions on the chat box, but I'll hand over to Mel, and she can obviously forward any questions on. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you, Julia. Thanks for that. That was a really great summary of the paperwork involved with agency agreements and distributor agreements. If anybody does have any questions, if you could just please type them now. I do believe on the next slide is Julia's contact details. Obviously, you can either contact us via the FDEA or contact Julia direct if you do have any questions. And also going forward, if you do have any issues or any questions regarding your distribution agreements, then you now know that Roythornes Solicitors are experts in this field and will be able to help you going forward. It looks like nobody's got any questions at the moment. I've just seen that somebody joined us late. Yes, we will be sending the presentation and the recording of the presentation to registered participants afterwards. So you will receive these today. But like I said, any questions, do feel free to contact myself or Julia.
Yes, just to reiterate, thank you, Mel. Yes, please do drop me a line or give me a call, and obviously I'm very happy to take questions after this call. Delighted to hear from you. So please do get in contact.
Brilliant. Okay, and that's it for now then. So we will be, okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks very much. Bye-bye. Bye.